We're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melting into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, she, her, and hers, and I am the Senior Partnerships Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I am very excited to welcome our next guest onto the interview series, Anee Korme. She is the Director at the Raben Group's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion practice. Anee, thank you so much for being here. If you want to share a little bit about yourself for our listeners, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, do you remember how exactly you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Sure. Thank you so much, Christina, for having me. So Anee Korme, pronouns are she and hers. As you mentioned, I'm a director with the Raben Group's Beyond Diversity Strategies practice. And a lot of my work is really thinking about how to provide strategic diversity, equity, inclusion solutions for various companies. They range from small tech startups to larger NGOs, global organizations. It really runs the gamut. When I was younger, I think I really thought of the question of what I wanted to be as someone who was a helper. I think initially I thought of myself as like a teacher. Over time that evolved to working in the nonprofit space. I ended up working in education for many years and its intersection with diversity, equity, inclusion, doing in-house DEI work at higher ed institutions across the nation. So I ended up being in that helper role, but for sure, that was something that really drove me, was thinking about how to support others.
That's awesome. I bet you are kind of helping others and supporting folks day to day and for their long-term strategy as well in the work that you are doing. And I would love to know if there are any kind of patterns you're seeing in the organizations you consult with, from the ones who are really looking to do deeper equity work, whether it's common questions or kind of starting points you see for organizations to get involved.
Yeah, so something that is really huge across many organizations is really thinking about how to really create a culture that is truly inclusive. Just recognizing all of the sort of external challenges to many organizations. I think some things that a lot of executive leaders are struggling with is how to manage how their staff are impacted by things that are beyond sort of the institution's scope. So thinking about what happened with like the global pandemic, thinking about our sort of national reckoning around race and systemic racism, thinking about how individuals maybe were impacted by police shootings of different people. So I think that's how staff are being impacted by the world around us is showing up, especially as folks are working from home. A lot of that tends to bleed into organizations.
Yeah, we definitely can't check our lived experiences, our identities, what we're going through outside of work at the door, even if we are working virtually as well, outside of these boxes that we're in on the screen. And this work is really hard. There's a lot of emotional labor that goes into it. And sometimes I would say most of the time you don't see the fruits of your labor every day. So I would love to ask, as a consultant, what is a current or past project that really brought you joy?
Sure. For me, I think the joy is in executive coaching. So seeing the ways in which mental models and mindsets shift over time is really powerful, especially when it sits at the top of an organization. I've seen organizational leaders really change their perspective when it comes to power sharing, change their perspective when it comes to leading with vulnerability, acknowledging their own mistakes in a public forum, being super transparent when it comes to their own decision making, really advocating for staff and staff needs, sharing their platform with staff across the hierarchy. So I think in those moments, that's really where I find the most meaning, and I've seen the largest sort of institutional impact as well.
Yeah, that modeling of the kind of leadership and also the role of executives too, to really exhibit that kind of inclusive and equity-driven mindset, and also kind of the power sharing that you're talking about as well. In terms of the organization, I know that companies and workplaces are kind of those microcosms of society. What role do you see private companies playing in creating a more equitable world?
Wow, what a powerful question. So I think it's a couple of things. One, I think, as you mentioned, because they are a microcosm of larger society, it's helping citizens really build those skills on how to relate and connect with one another. The ways in which we show up in our personal lives are the ways in which we show up at work and vice versa. So I think it's an opportunity to really help folks learn, build skills, connect across difference, learn more about different communities, which I think will have really sort of a spreading effect. The other way is thinking about like the impact of their work. I think as more organizations are thinking about equity as a value, and how all parts of their organization can really center that work. There's opportunity to think about how equity will then sit in the outcomes of each of those organizations, whether that's a different marketing strategy, whether that's thinking about their social impact, whether that's thinking about how to be more inclusive when it comes to their market. So there's a ton of ways and different opportunities, but I think at the center of that is really thinking about like the individual and how it impacts different people.
Yeah, I like the kind of phrase you used around equity as a value. And that collaboration piece is so important because it's not one person or even department's kind of responsibility there to be thinking with that equity driven lens. What is your kind of philosophy around the framework for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging to be focused on that value to the business overall and not siloed into one or two kind of functional areas?
Yeah, so to me, it's almost similar, not quite, but almost similar to thinking about like compliance, how it sits in organizations. Like everyone has an ethical responsibility to use finances in an ethical way. However, there might be a sole functional area called compliance that helps to oversee that work across, but individual contributors can then think about how do I then show up in my work to make sure my actions are leading towards that overall goal. And for me, equity work is the same. So thinking about, while we might have an overall sort of value statement or strategy as it pertains to equity, each individual contributor should be able to think about, okay, in my own work, how does that drive up to that larger work? And I think there are, a ton of different ways that they can show up in different companies. When I've seen that work done well, I've seen organizations have the opportunity to really drive equity work as it pertains to goal setting for individual contributors. They have competency set for individual contributors. Their learning and professional development is also tied to that work for individual contributors. So it's really coming from a multitude of different places. And each individual contributor has the opportunity to really think about really owning that work for themselves.
Yeah, having that ownership mentality, it's great to say we want to be more inclusive in our hiring practices, but as a hiring manager, what am I going to do tomorrow to make sure that I am thinking about that? How is that tied to my performance? Is it in your reviews? Are you talking about it? Is it a competency as well? Making sure there's common language across the business too. There's been a lot of conversations with kind of remote first or hybrid working and kind of going back into the office around this psychological safety, a term coined by Amy Edmondson. What are key pillars of a sustainable strategy to set up your workplace to have that psychological safety, knowing that it's super important to have that intentionality behind it?
Yeah, so I think there's a cost benefit analysis that needs to take place at each organization. I think a lot of it depends on the type of work that folks are doing. It depends on how your business is situated. I know there are some organizations that have offices across the country versus some that have a sole office in one location. Also thinking about, what are your staff saying? I think that's paramount to how you're sort of thinking about that work and how they will perceive their own safety, right? Are they heard? Are they listened to? what are their current needs. I think some organizations who have done it well are absolutely doing that hybrid model, leaving the flexibility and again, autonomy of choice up to their, staff members. And then thinking about what are the accommodations needed for folks, because we absolutely have a new reality now. I think a lot of people forget we can't just rewind time to 2019. The world looks different now. Commuting to offices looks different now. The cost of that looks different now. Family care looks different now. There's so many things that are different in our new world that will require folks to think about coming into the office in a different way. So thinking about how you can support folks and offer different resources to make that feasible, and not framing it as a zero sum sort of, like either you have to come into the office or it's remote, or come into the office or you can't work here. So
Yeah, that flexibility is definitely related to kind of equity as well, in terms of how you're thinking about the different roles people have outside of work, if they are caretakers, if they are kind of parents, and kind of all of the different kind of schedules as well, in terms of asynchronous work and productivity too. We can't just say go back to business as usual as well. It's intentionally building these systems. I know we talked about kind of that individual ownership before and creating that systemic change. How should we specifically be holding senior leaders and, of course, managers, who are the ultimate kind of folks that we are working with on a day-to-day basis, really accountable to practice that equity-driven mindset, looking internally at the processes they have kind of the impact on?
yeah, so I think one of the biggest things is making sure that there is alignment between what folks are saying and what they're doing. So I think the first step is to get clear on what the intentions are of those senior leaders, whatever that looks like. If there's opportunities for senior leaders to get explicit about what their goals are regarding equity, how they plan to resource and fund that work, and thinking about how that feeds into the organization's strategy overall. That's a good starting place. And once those goals are clear, I think the follow-up to that is being in constant communication. The challenge with equity work is that one, it's super dynamic. Two, there are always emergent issues. And the work is really iterative, and it should be. So thinking about how to just remain in constant communication and allow that flexibility to say, okay, while these were the stated goals, our context is a little bit different. How are we continuing to evolve that to make sure that there is still that alignment between what folks have said and what they are doing? I think the misalignment there leads to fractured trust. And once that happens, it becomes almost impossible to sort of move equity work along.
Yeah, that effective communication, the words that you're using, what do you mean when you say this, and what does that mean in terms of goals, alignment across the organization, and especially with leaders when they are communicating to their teams. I think I know the answer to this question based on what we talked about earlier, but do you think it is a requirement for organizations to really hold that intentional space and provide resources for hard, vulnerable, uncomfortable conversations?
I think yes and no. So I will say yes in that I think for many people, a lot of conversations are uncomfortable. I think the idea behind equity work is that that discomfort is amortized across all groups, right? That everyone is experiencing a bit of discomfort, and not just folks who have historically marginalized identities, and not just folks who maybe are not of the majority in whatever space that they're in. So I would say yes, in that, there's always going to be an uncomfortable conversation. My no is that I don't know that every organization is best suited for those uncomfortable conversations, especially as it pertains to some things that are happening in our national climate. The challenge there is, in order to have those conversations, there has to be a bit of level setting that happens. Folks have to come into that conversation with the same sort of understanding of terminology, with the same sort of understanding of what race, racism means, what diversity means, what equity and inclusion means. Outside of that, it feels like it's not even truly a conversation, right? It feels like some people are talking at a higher level and some people are maybe confused. So I think in that sense, I don't encourage many organizations to necessarily have that space, especially a space where folks are complied to participate. I think there are opportunities to invite people in like learning circles to be in dialogue around, difficult conversations. But yeah, so I think yes and no.
Yeah, there's no black and white answer, and people can tell when you are just looking to check a box or, say that we have this space for this conversation, but not identifying if it is kind of more educational. Is it a space for healing? Is it a space to share stories? Nobody likes being put on the spot either as well or complied to answer.
Yeah.
So I think that definitely makes sense. With so many things happening externally in the world, as you kind of mentioned as well, have you seen really good examples of how organizations intentionally not perpetuate that trauma internally at their organization?
Yeah, so the organizations that really did well over the last 2 years were organizations that already had systems in place. So I know there were some organizations that had affinity spaces that were facilitated by external partners who not only regularly, whether it was monthly, bi-monthly, facilitated conversations around, how folks were experiencing the organizations, but they were already having those conversations around how folks were experiencing their identity in the larger world as well. So there was already an infrastructure in place when this emergent sort of things started happening in our world and space around us. So I think the lesson there was, once you have those systems in place, you can then be prepared to sort of deal with all the things that will absolutely continue to come up. So thinking about how to really, one, listen to the needs of staff and make sure that you are tuned in and dialed into the spaces that folks need, and to resource them in a sustainable way. So it's not just a sort of one-off, that it's an infrastructure that can support those conversations and communities moving forward.
Absolutely. And being proactive about setting up those structures as well, not being reactive. And nobody could have predicted a global pandemic and all of the chaos that is going to continue to ensue. But you can make sure that you are strategically thinking about how can we show up for employees? How can we really think about having these conversations and opening up that space, actively listening? I know kind of earlier organizations who had that infrastructure set up, one of them comes to mind for me is Ben and Jerry's, for kind of progressive and forward thinking, like stating what they mean, being direct and authentic in their equity work, and saying, when they miss the mark as well. Do you have examples of folks or organizations who are really showing up, acknowledging where they are, and sharing that out with the world?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the organizations that work in the environmental space are absolutely doing that. National Wildlife Federation is one that comes to mind. They are absolutely very mindful about, one, their footprint in the world, the language that they use, are constantly redefining terminology. So the ways in which they talked about diversity, equity, inclusion, and now justice today looks very different than it did, 5 years ago or 5 years before that. Which makes a lot of sense because the environmental space is also very dynamic and constantly evolving. So I think that's something to note. I find like most organizations that have or work in a sector that requires them to evolve and pivot quickly tend to be better suited to sort of move quickly when it comes to equity work as well.
Yeah, I appreciate that example too, of just being aware of the footprint of how we're leaving the world after our impact too. And even with the best intentions, I know a lot of folks are at different parts of their equity journey, and they're really thinking about innovation when business as usual again is not the way we need to move forward. Are there any kind of mistakes you're still seeing folks make in their equity strategy and then pivoting away from?
Yeah, so I think when folks think about their equity journey, sometimes folks think of it sort of as this like sort of linear path, when in fact it's very much up and down because the world around us changes. So I've seen organizations that maybe 20 years ago were at the cutting edge, and maybe today not so much. So I think a couple of things. For the folks who are doing it well. One, it's again being in constant dialogue with your people. I think your staff will absolutely drive on what needs to happen when it comes to your equity work, especially thinking about new professionals and folks who are coming into the space. I think something that's very unique about our workplace today is that we have the most amount of representation when it comes to the various generations. So thinking about the diversity among age, there's such a great opportunity for folks to really lean into this conversation around diversity, equity, inclusion, and what that looks like, and so much learning to happen. I think one of the mistakes that folks make is thinking that there is a one size fits all, or wanting to compare themselves to other organizations, or thinking about, what are those best practices that we can apply to our organization. And I think the starting place is truly like getting to know who you are, and then thinking about what then are the solutions that make sense for who you are, who your people are, your work, the impact that you're trying to have, and driving from there.
Absolutely. Going back to that self-awareness, where are we as an organization? Where are we as leaders? Who is in our company? How are we kind of actively listening? And then going from there, we can definitely kind of listen to those best practices, listen to great stories, and think about it from an aspirational perspective. But there's no cookie cutter approach or playbook to how to do things correctly, because everybody is different. The makeup of your organization, you have to look internally to do that, and see what kind of work you can do moving forward as a leader. Is there anything that I didn't ask in our kind of conversation today, or one or two key takeaways you want to underscore for our listeners that you hope they bring with them after hearing our episode today?
Yeah, so I think just one final thought is really thinking about like the power of storytelling. I mentioned today that I really think it starts with like the person, the people, the culture. And a lot of times organizations really think about driving towards key performance indicators or benchmarks, or how to sort of drive the work forward. But really thinking about how can you connect, even if it feels like anecdotal, how can you connect with your staff to get a better sense of how you are being effective in the work, what the impact is of the work. That can be really meaningful as well, even if it's regular town halls, or having office hours, or just casual conversations as folks are coming back into the workplace. Just having a clear pulse on how folks are experiencing the organization is one of the best data points there.
Yeah, the power of storytelling. And you're right in terms of how people are experiencing the culture, because that's also going to be different depending on who you ask. If they started a day ago, if they have been there for 5 years, and
Yeah.
their year point in their development as well. Ani, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture this afternoon. I enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. And as a reminder for folks who are listening, at AllVoices, we really believe in employees and employers really being seen, heard, and understood. And we know that it is a critical part of the business overall. Have a great rest of your afternoon, everyone.